Well, hello everyone, and it's so good to see you all today. We have Dr. Russell Ray and Dr. Savannah Lusk here today to talk about just our research around SIDS and SUID and what it kind of looks like as we're moving into this next phase of really trying to pinpoint exactly what is causing these horrific things to happen, as well as what are some things that we're doing to be able to educate communities around that. And so I'm going to start with you, Russell, if you'd just like to kind of give us a little overview about yourself and some of the work you're doing, High Point, and then we'll go to you, Savannah.
Certainly, and thank you so much for having us. It's a delight to be here. So I'm an associate professor at Baylor College of Medicine and the director of the Isabel Davis Center for Save Children, which is a joint center between TCH and Baylor College of Medicine that is being developed and founded both by myself and my partner and colleague, Dr. Savannah Lusk. She'll tell you more about her role as co-director. And the idea behind that center really is to take a multifaceted approach in a number of different ways to really try and understand what leads to SIDS and SUID, as well as to engage in community outreach in several programs, again, that Savannah will tell you more about. And
I'm a co-director of the Isabel Davis Center for Safe Children, and my role is largely trying to incorporate all of the different data streams that we have coming in into basically a more holistic picture of what's causing these kinds of deaths and different new preventative strategies based off of that information. And so we have several different avenues that we kind of branch out into the community and also within the lab, and kind of incorporating all that together to kind of have more realistic modeling of what these deaths really look like.
Well, I'm going to get right into it. I know you all are doing several things and just love to hear some high points. I know you are doing some work around genetic modification. You just kind of like to share and put it in layman's terms as much as possible for us that might not understand that.
Sure. So at the heart of, or one of the key components of our research program is trying to understand all these different things that come together, resulting in a SIDS or SUID case, what really is happening inside the body. And once we kind of have that insight, that leads to a whole set of different avenues where we might be able to do something to make a difference. And at the heart of trying to understand what happens inside the body with these different risk factors is the use of a mouse. So that's kind of our surrogate for trying to understand how breathing and heart rate may fail or stop in an infant in a SIDS or SUID case. And as you brought up genetic modification, we actually take kind of two approaches to that. The first one is that we know now more and more through a number of different investigations in the field that a subset of SIDS cases are associated with some sort of genetic mutation. Right? But the problem is, in many cases, is we don't know if that genetic mutation either matters or doesn't. In fact, every baby is born with anywhere from 30 to 60 or more genetic mutations that mom and dad do not have. They're just new ones that happen through the process of that embryo or that child being conceived and developing. And so many of those mutations don't matter, right? But one of them might, and it might be the thing that has driven SIDS. But we really need a test for that. So what's notable is that we can test that in two ways. We can go in and just look at the gene that has the mutation, and we can just get rid of that. And that's an old school classic way of doing it. Probably gives you the biggest impact, and see if something like that may affect cardiorespiratory function. The other thing is a little more nuanced, and so much of our genome is shared, has similar sequences, similar properties between humans and mice, at least especially around breathing and heart function. We can go in and actually make, in many cases, that same mutation the baby had, right? Leaving the gene more or less intact, and then see what kind of changes may have happened. And sometimes those can actually be very dramatic, or they may be more subtle, but we learn a lot from that. And then a second approach that we do is with our genetically modified mice is we go in and we put in synthetic genetic programs that allow us to manipulate or turn on and off a different part of the brain. And this is actually a project that Savannah has done a huge amount of work on and has published a couple of papers on. It has a great story coming out. So I'll actually let her take that part over because she can tell you a little bit more about the details of this work and what it means. And it's actually a very, I think, informative way to start thinking about sudden infant death syndrome and SUID.
Yeah. Sure. So, like Russell said, the classic way of looking at genetic variants we see in these infants is to knock the gene out or mutate it in some way. And a lot of the information we really have about what's going on is from brainstem neuropathology, from pathological studies post-mortem. And one of the issues we have, though, is there's not like a direct pathway of this mutation leads to this disruption that we see at the cellular level in the brain, right? So it's hard to, even if you do identify a genetic factor, to say that that would lead to a decreased number of those neurons in this part of the brain, and therefore that's what's going on. And so a really valuable tool that we've been working with is this ability to basically inhibit or activate subsets of neurons within the brain so we can understand what their function is. And it's a bit more in line with what you would expect with slightly fewer neurons or slightly less neurotransmitter, whatever the case might be. We can kind of just, let's inhibit it a little bit and see what that does. Let's activate it a little bit. And so those are the kinds of tools that we've been implementing to understand different neural systems. And in particular, it's serotonin and noradrenaline that we've really been looking at.
And since we're on this genetic piece here, I know you are doing genetic sequencing now in the state of Texas. Am I correct? Can you give me a little bit more?
Yeah, almost. So we are building that program out. There's a lot of, as you can imagine, there's a lot of bureaucracy, red tape when you start talking about whole genome sequencing. But we do have the protocols, they're in review. We're expecting it to come through in the next few months. But Russell can really talk about that a bit more. He's been leading that effort with getting that off the ground.
Yeah, so it's been a lot of lessons learned. And of course, a big important part of this is all about consent, making sure that, the parents whose child has been lost, that their wishes are respected and that this is all handled in a respectful manner. So of course, that is a whole process that we want to ensure we develop well. But really at the heart of what we're trying to do is set up a program where we can sequence and read out the entire genome. So when a child does pass, more recent accreditation requirements have the expectation that a medical examiner will at least look at certain parts of the genome that we know very often can harbor a mutation or a change that could be pathological. And that way you can just quickly rule that in or out. But what we thought here was that with that being on the horizon, we could reach out to different medical examiners and partner with them and provide that information that they need to do their job. Yet we could also look at the whole genome. We might also find new things that people would not typically be looking for with this. And what we hope in the end then that this brings together with this program is that we can build these partnerships and bridges with our medical examiner partners to, further expand that into other areas of research. We might be able to find new discoveries and build those research resources. And then all together with the medical examiners, a review of that genetic information, and then maybe even our own team, we might then bring back to the parents substantive answers that give them a little bit more understanding of the sequence of events that led to the loss of their child. So we hope in total, through the generous donation of one of the philanthropists who helped develop our center, Jenny Elkins, whose granddaughter was lost to SIDS, that's Isabel Davis. With her help and resources, what we want to do is first inside of Harris County and then with other partnering agencies inside of Texas to ultimately cover the whole of Texas, as well as even partners outside of the state of Texas as we grow this program. So we're trying to line people up on this, is to offer this for free, right? Again, so the parents always have that option, so the medical examiners can do their job, and then to create a strong research resource that will help us find answers in the future.
Great. Savannah, me and you had discussion before about the socioeconomic factors, and what are you doing around research in that area as well? Would you like to share that? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are a lot of socioeconomic factors that have been identified in SUID cases. And so most of those studies are just associative, right? So we see that they tend to come from poor neighborhoods. The parents may or may not have gone past high school. Mothers are typically younger. And it's valuable information because it does help us to target preventative strategies, bring different resources into those communities that might be needed more there than somewhere else. But the issue that's always bothered me is okay, there's the mom's young, but why does that, what physiologically is a result of that leads to these deaths? And like trying to actually understand biologically, how does socioeconomic factors actually play into the death itself? Some of these are harder to model than others. Right now, I can't really say much beyond, there are some differences, but one of the things I'm looking at now is air pollution. And so that is something that is, something we see in these communities where it's lower income housing that tends to have a lot of minorities that live in these areas and in these communities and neighborhoods. And we do have a lot of information about what kind of airborne pollutants are going to be in these areas versus other areas. And so I've been doing some geospatial mapping and correlating different times of death and exposure profiles with those airborne pollutants. And we found some really interesting things regarding some of the things, because, Houston is a big industrial center. We've got all kinds of things happening here. And so some of those gases and everything that's released, we do see relationships with it. And the beauty of it is that's something we can bring back and model in the mouse. So we can expose them to various levels of these airborne pollutants from these neighborhoods and actually understand what biological mechanism could be at play in terms of leading to death or impaired cardiorespiratory function in these infants.
Great. Thank you for giving us that information. So I know we don't have a lot of time, but I want to talk a little bit more about your law enforcement training and what are you all doing around that?
Absolutely. So I am the research analyst for the Child Fatality Review team here in Texas, and I was just elected to the state team for Texas. And one of the duties that we have is we have to enter data from each of these cases into the national database run by the National Center for Fatality Review and Prevention. And when I was reviewing these cases, I started probably 2 or 3 years ago, I realized that a lot of the information that they wanted, it wasn't in the reports. And so we just leave them blank. And it really bothered me because some of it seems really important, and it's just like, it was really frustrating because there was so much data missing. And what really seemed to impact it, and there have been studies on this too, in that is that, oftentimes investigators can go in and kind of make assumptions about certain situations that these families are in. And so they stop asking questions because they think it's obvious that this baby would have passed one way or the other. And so what I've done is, instead of just complaining about the data, I created a law enforcement training course for cops throughout the state of Texas. And then I was actually called out to teach a class in Louisiana last week. So it's expanding, but we teach them why it's important to ask all these questions and exactly what information we are gleaning from it and how it relates to the research side of things. And so it accomplishes kind of 2 tasks. One is that it makes the investigator's job a lot easier because they can explain to the parents why they need to know certain things. Because, the parents can sometimes be resistant to answering questions. It does feel like a violation of privacy at times as well. We explain that to the cops, like you need to tell them why you're asking it rather than just kind of demanding answers in a certain sense. And so once the cops understand, they can explain that to the parents. The parents are at ease, they're more likely to have that conversation. The second thing is as part of this class, I redesigned the SIDS form, which is the suicide investigation form that was created by the CDC originally. And I did this with law enforcement input. And so the new form is essentially a questionnaire. It's an interview. Just like, if you go on a podcast or something, they send you questions in preparation, right? Yes. So it's meant to make this an interview rather than an interrogation. And that's the big framework within which we, teach this class. Is like, you've already determined this is, not a criminal act, but that doesn't mean the investigation stops. We still want to know why. And one of the biggest points that I make that sits with these cops is that every question that they don't ask on this form is a potential answer that a parent will never get as to why their child passed. And so I think that really sits with them, especially given, these are not short questionnaires. They're 12 pages long with, 50 some questions on each page. It's taxing both for the investigator and for the parents. And so by improving this form and the way that it flows and how the questions are recorded, the answers are recorded, it helps both sides to get through it with ease, but also provide us with the information we really need to understand the full exposure profile of these children.
Well, great. Well, I know this was short, and we hope that you'll be on our panel as we go into our next round of this session. But just kind of a departing question, looking ahead, what is the most urgent thing that you hope that you can address from research in regards to, combining genetics and socioeconomics and environmental factors, all of those things? What is maybe the one thing that you all are really hoping to look toward and to achieve in the future? Mm-hmm.
So I'll let Russell give an answer, and then I'll give an answer first. Okay. So what I want is actionable items to actually begin preventing some of these deaths. And I think that far too long we've relied on just education and trying to modify the education and get it to people. And I think we've seen by and large it's not effective anymore. It's just not an effective way. But if we can actually identify specific groupings of some of these exposure profiles, we can then say, lobby for environmental changes. Like, how can we put filters into the homes that are within a certain range from the pollutant, source, to get that out of the air and improve the air quality? Things that we can actually change, modifiable factors that don't put all of the pressure on the parents and these families who are already in stressed situations. And so that's really what I want to see coming out of this in the future.
Right. And Russ?
Yeah. like there's so many things to pick from. You really want to see, ultimately what we're trying to do in some way or another is try in all these different avenues to end SIDS and SUID, right? And I think Savannah gave a great answer. What can we do as quickly as possible to go out into the community and make those changes? And that's an incredible, the important pillar of trying to bring about that end. And then with that idea in mind, from my perspective, I think what we can come to understand about how ultimately that physiology fails. If we can understand that, then that opens up a pathway for us to do, I think, two key things. One is find biomarkers or ways to identify those infants at risk. And that may come from their risk profile in the neighborhood, their zip code and everything. And Savannah's been working on risk calculators and things like that will help identify, that as potentially a modifiable factor. Maybe it's their genome sequencing, maybe it's a blood test, something like that. But once we understand which infants are at risk, and importantly, why, because they're going to be at risk for different things, then, they can go under enhanced monitoring in that first year of life. But then the next key is going to be to come up with some sort of therapeutic intervention. And again, that may be unique to even down to specific infants or different groups of infants, because again, it'll be different risk profiles. It'll be a different pollutant, a different genetic mutation. So another thing I think that's going to be very important is to start developing potential therapeutics or drugs or other types of intervention, even if it's just enhanced monitoring, where we can then help those at-risk infants get through that first year of life.
Thank you. So I know we're closing, but there is a conference coming up, and I just want you all to be able to put a plug, and we have information too on our platform, but just tell us about that if you can.
Yeah, so it's the International Society for the Study and Prevention of Perinatal and Infant Death, mouthful. We call it ISPID lovingly. And so we're having our biannual conference. It's every 2 years. It's been happening for a really long time. And we have top players in every field and aspect of death in childhood. So it covers stillbirth, SUID, SIDS, and sudden unexplained death in childhood, so SUID-C. And so we have experts from bereavement to epidemiology, pathology, death scene investigation and child death review, and physiology. I'm sure I'm missing some of them, but we have specialists from each of those fields from around the world.
Bereavement is one.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, bereavement. So, there's sessions. Basically, if you're in the field and you're attending this webinar, you have a reason to go. You're going to learn something and you're going to make a connection that's going to be valuable for whatever work you're doing. So,
well, great. We'll have all that information on how to register, and people just look into, again, on the platform. And with that, I just want to thank each one of you for taking time out of your extremely busy schedule. And thank you for the information and keep up the great work for sure.
Thank you, Stacy.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you for having us.